The first thing Sergeant Mara Voss noticed about the Veth was that they never looked surprised. She'd been watching them for 3 weeks through the rangefinder scope of a Korvath pattern observation post dug into the black basalt shelf above Camp Curran, and in all that time, through 2 skirmishes, 1 full artillery engagement, and the annihilation of a 12-man recon squad 3 clicks east, not once had she seen a Veth soldier flinch. Not one of their pale, triple-jointed bodies had recoiled from an explosion, turned toward a sound, or reached reflexively for a weapon. They moved like people who had already seen the film. They reached for cover before the rounds arrived. They pivoted toward the flanking team while the flanking team was still deciding to flank. They repositioned their artillery emplacements 8 hours before the 3rd Combined Battalion's fire mission requests were even submitted. It was this quality, more than the hive mind theories or the supposed psi-link or the wild stories circulating out of the Eastern Theater about Veth, soldiers who laughed at captivity because they claimed to have already lived through their own deaths, that kept Mara from sleeping. She had a theory. It was not a comfortable one. She wrote it out by hand in a waterproof field notebook while a cold November wind came down off the Tesseran Plateau. And the moons of this planet, a world the UEF had named Korvath IV but which the colonists called Briar, because of the black scrub that bled red in the autumn like something dying with dignity, turned the clouds silver. The observation post was a shallow excavation, barely 2 meters deep, framed with prefab carbon composite and covered with a thermal suppression tarp that made the interior smell of cooking electronics and old sweat. She shared it with 2 people. Corporal Fenna Daisy, who was 22 and had grown up on a fishing platform in the Oceanic Collective, and who dealt with stress by cleaning his rifle with a methodical care that bordered on devotion, and Private Tamsin Yu, who was 19 and who had been assigned to the OP because she could calculate artillery trajectories in her head to 4 decimal places and had not yet learned that this made her valuable in ways that had nothing to do with her own preferences. Yu was sleeping when Mara wrote the theory down. A Daisy was on scope, his eye pressed to the rubber eyepiece, making small marks on his map sheet with the mechanical discipline of someone performing a ritual whose meaning he'd stopped questioning. "Corporal," Mara said quietly, "tell me again what you saw at 1740. A Daisy didn't move from the scope. Gun Crew 3 Whiskey started repositioning their piece 17 minutes before the 3rd's fire mission was called in. I logged it because it didn't make sense. Did you ever fire artillery on a fishing platform?" A pause. "No, Sergeant. Artillery takes time. You decide to call a mission, you submit the request, it goes up the chain, someone approves it, someone else coordinates the battery. Fastest you can turn a request into steel on target is 22 minutes if everything goes perfectly. Usually 40. She tapped her pen against the notebook page. 3 Whiskey started moving 17 minutes before the request was submitted. A Daze was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's impossible. That's what I keep writing down," she said, and then crossing out, "because it's not the right word. Impossible is what we call things that contradict our model of reality. What the Veth do contradicts our model, but not, apparently, theirs." She circled the line she'd written and stared at it until a Daisy's head came up from the scope, and he looked at her with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who had just understood something they didn't want to have understood. "They know," he said. "They always know." "They know what's probable," she said. "Those are different things. But the gap between them is very small if your opponent is predictable." She thought about the recon squad. 12 soldiers, experienced, well-briefed, using a route that 3 independent tactical analyses had assessed as the optimal approach corridor. They died in an ambush that had been waiting for them not in the obvious position, but in the secondary one, the one that good soldiers chose to avoid the obvious. The Veth had calculated that any competent unit would avoid the obvious position, so they'd positioned in the secondary. And the 12 men and women of the recon squad had walked into it with the reliability of a billiard ball, rolling down a predictable groove. "We're very predictable," she said. "We've spent 11 years of war making ourselves more predictable by training harder and following doctrine more rigorously and learning to make better tactical decisions. We've been optimizing for efficiency against an opponent that benefits from our efficiency." She underlined it twice. "They don't predict, they remember." She explained it in the morning, in the command tent, to Captain Driss Haugen. Haugen was a tall man with a jaw like a ship's prow. and the cautious eyes of someone who had been right once and never forgot what being wrong had cost him. He'd commanded the 7th Expeditionary 2nd Regiment through 4 campaigns on 3 planets, and he had the quality, rare in officers, of listening to things that challenged his operational assumptions, without immediately reaching for a reason they were wrong. He'd inherited this from his predecessor, who'd been killed by a Veth unit that had anticipated the commander's evacuation route and prepositioned a blocking force there 6 hours before the order to evacuate was given. Haugen had taken over with the lesson already printed in him like a brand. The Veth were not guessing. They were knowing. He stood over the folding table in the command tent, surrounded by overlapping maps and printouts from the orbital reconnaissance platform, the one the UEF's 7th Expeditionary Command had paid 300 lives to keep in orbit, and he let Mara talk. She talked for 20 minutes. She covered the gun repositioning and the recon squad and a dozen smaller observations she'd logged over 3 weeks, the cumulative pattern of which formed a picture that was uncomfortable to look at directly but impossible to ignore. When she finished, Haugen was still looking at the maps. "You've been submitting pattern analysis requests to Central for 6 weeks, he said. "Yes, sir." They came back. He pushed a data pad across the table. "The math is yours. The conclusion is theirs. Took 6 xenophysicists and a supercomputer 4 days to get there. You got there in 6 weeks with a scope and a notebook." She picked up the pad. The conclusion read, "Veth combat behavior consistent with nonlinear temporal perception. Hypothesis: Veth sensory or cognitive architecture allows direct experiential access to probable near-future states. Range unknown. Confidence interval 94.7%. She read it twice. A weight she hadn't known she was carrying shifted slightly, not disappearing but redistributing. The difference between carrying a heavy thing alone and having someone else confirm that the thing was in fact heavy. "They see the future," she said. "They see a future. Possible futures, plural, weighted by probability." Haugen finally looked at her. "The difference matters. Central says it's like, imagine you've read the last chapter of a book. You know how it ends. But if someone tears that chapter out and writes a new one, you're lost." "Entropy," Mara said, and Haugen blinked. "I'm sorry? Entropy. Disorder. They're fighting us like the universe runs on a clock and the clock doesn't lie." She set the pad down. "But we're not a clock. We're the wine glass." He stared at her for a long moment. "Explain that." She explained it over the next 2 hours, using the maps and the pad and, when she ran out of both, a stick to draw in the dirt floor of the tent. Haugen listened without interrupting, which was the thing about him that had made Mara request this posting in the first place. "The Veth," she said, "lived in what physicists, specifically one Brian Greene, a pre-contact theorist whose work the UEF Xenocognition Division had been quietly reassessing for the past 11 years, called a block of universe, not a metaphor, a literal architecture of consciousness. For the Veth, past, present, and future were not sequential events. They were simultaneous layers. A Veth warrior didn't foresee a grenade landing to his left. He existed, in some cognitive sense, in the moment before it landed, and the moment it landed, and the moment he stepped aside from it, all at once, the way you exist simultaneously in every frame of a film you've watched twice." She drew 2 lines in the dirt, one straight and horizontal, the human experience of time, a river flowing in one direction, one vertical, cutting through the horizontal at a right angle. The Veth experience of time, all moments simultaneously accessible, the river seen from above. This was why they never looked surprised. Surprise required the arrival of new information. For the Veth, there was no new information. There was only existing information resolving into clarity, the way a landscape revealed itself as you climbed above it, not appearing but becoming visible. "But there's a limit," Mara said. "Has to be. If there wasn't, they'd have won this war in 3 days." "The book's last chapter," Haugen said slowly. "The high probability branch. They experience the future that is most likely, not the future that will happen. The difference is microscopic when you're talking about physics. Billiard balls, planetary motion, predictable systems. But human beings aren't predictable systems." She drew a circle in the dirt. Inside it, she drew a smaller circle. "The Veth can see inside the outer circle, the space of all likely futures. Everything inside the outer circle they can read. But there's this smaller space, the deeply improbable that falls outside their window, too unlikely to wait, too anomalous to model. They don't look there because their entire cognitive architecture is optimized for probability. She tapped the gap between the circles. That's where we have to live. Hagen looked at the diagram for a long time. Then you're saying we're unpredictable enough to blind them. I'm saying we're the only species in this war that can choose to do the stupid thing. She paused. Every other species in the UEF catalog, apparently, is a billiard ball system. You can model them because evolution pressured them toward rational behavior, optimal behavior, and they've spent their civilizational history getting more rational and more optimal. Humans went a different way. We evolved in an environment so chaotic, so unpredictable, that rationality alone wasn't enough. We needed irrationality too. We needed the capacity to act on intuition that couldn't be justified, to break our own patterns, to do the deeply suboptimal thing sometimes just because something in us decided it was right. She stood up. The stick was still in her hand. She looked at the two circles in the dirt. They've been modeling us as though we're like everyone else, she said. But we're the shattering wineglass. We break in 1,000 directions, and when a wineglass shatters, you can't reverse it. The pieces don't reassemble. The disorder is permanent. Silence held the tent for a moment. The wind pressed against the sides like something trying to listen. "Sergeant," Haugen said finally, "I need you to understand something. What you're describing as a solution is asking human soldiers to deliberately make suicidal tactical choices on the grounds that being too crazy to model will give us an advantage. Not suicidal, genuinely random. The distinction matters. Suicidal is a pattern too. Self-sacrifice follows predictable logic. What I'm describing is removing intentionality from the decision entirely. Letting chance drive the choices so there's no intention for them to model. How?" She reached into her vest pocket, set a pair of dice on the table between them. Hagen looked at them for a very long time. "Brief the platoon commanders at 0600, he said finally. "Full operational detail. I want a plan on my table by noon." She'd been born on a generation ship. That was the part of her life Mara Voss never talked about. Not because it shamed her, but because people's eyes went soft and distant when you said it the way they went when you mentioned you'd grown up in a church or a cult or a prison, some total institution that warped your understanding of space and time and left you permanently calibrated to a different scale of things. The Covenant of Meridian had been in transit for 61 years by the time she was born. She'd spent her first 14 years in a steel corridor 800 meters long and 40 wide, with a population of 1,000 people, and a sky that was a curved ceiling painted by someone who'd never seen a real sky. The painter, she'd learned later, had worked from photographs, from written descriptions, from second-hand accounts of blue and cloud. The result was sincere and wholly unconvincing. The blue too uniform, the clouds too symmetrical, the whole composition suggesting not sky but the idea of sky, the memory of sky, the aspiration toward sky. She had grown up under that aspiration and found it more honest than most truths she encountered later. The ship moved at a fraction of the speed of light. Fast enough, her teachers had told her. That time aboard the Meridian moved slightly slower than it did on Earth. Not noticeably, not in any way that touched a person's life directly, but measurably, provably. If you were on the Meridian for a year, slightly less than a year passed for you than for someone sitting still on a planet. The precision atomic clocks in the navigation module confirmed it continuously. They're ticking fractionally slower than the clocks on every planet and station in their long, slow drift through the nothing between stars. She'd thought about that constantly as a child, not with fear but with a kind of ferocious wonder. That the universe contained this mechanism, this tick in the gears of reality, that meant the clock on your wrist lied based on how fast you moved. That time was not a river but a landscape. That past and future were places, not moments. Her mother had explained it to her on the Habitat Ring's observation deck. The one small section of hull that contained a viewport, real glass, actual vacuum on the other side, when Mara was 12. Her mother was a theoretical physicist, the kind who didn't need a laboratory because the laboratory was her mind, and she explained complex ideas to her daughter with the patience of someone who had made a long peace with large and unkind things. Einstein said that time and space are the same thing. Her mother had told her, looking not at the viewport but at the math pad in her lap, because her mother always looked at the math. The same substance, just oriented differently. What we call space is the universe spread out in 3 dimensions. What we call time is the universe spread out in a 4th dimension, and we move through it. She'd tapped the pad. Not just through space-time. And the faster you move through space, the slower you move through time. It's a trade-off. The universe allows you only so much motion through the combined 4 dimensions of space-time. Speed through space and you slow through time. Stand still in space and time moves at its natural rate. So people on Earth age faster than us, Mara had said, imperceptibly in our case. But yes, if we were moving close to the speed of light, really like 99%, we could leave for a year and come back to find 50 years had passed. We'd barely have aged. Everyone we knew would be old. Mara had looked at the stars through the viewport. The stars that moved so slowly they seemed fixed. That feels like cheating, she'd said. Time doesn't cheat. It just doesn't care about our intuitions. Her mother had smiled then. That particular smile that meant she was about to say something that would take years to fully digest. And here's the stranger thing, Mara. The reason moving fast slows your time is because from the perspective of the universe, you and the Earth and the stars are all moving through time simultaneously. The past exists. The future exists. Right now. At the same time that we exist. Every moment that has ever happened is still out there, still real, fixed in the 4-dimensional object that is the universe. Our experience of time is something that flows, that changes, that passes. That's an artifact of our biology, not a feature of reality. Time is an illusion, a very convincing one, but an illusion. The young Mara had absorbed this slowly, the way cold absorbed into stone. Then how do we know what's real? Her mother had looked up from the math pad then, looked directly at her daughter, and said something that Mara had turned over in her mind for 20 years, polishing it the way the sea polished glass, wearing away the unnecessary parts until only the essential remained. You can know what's real and still live in the illusion, her mother said. The illusion isn't a mistake. It's how consciousness navigates a universe that's too complicated to experience raw. The question isn't whether the flow of time is real. The question is whether the life you live inside the illusion is the one you want. She'd become a soldier because the Meridian arrived at its destination when she was 14, and the planet it had been sent to colonize was already being contested by the Veth, and because of what happened to her parents in the first 6 months of contact. She kept the physics like a wound, tender, necessary, part of the shape of her. She stood in the pre-dawn dark of Camp Corinne's outer perimeter with 6 platoon commanders in a loose ring around her, their breath misting in the cold, their faces patient and skeptical in the way of people who had learned that patience and skepticism were survival traits. Lieutenant Cale Brennis was 23, from a mining colony on the second moon of Corvath III, compact and quiet with a quality of stillness that in other soldiers telegraphed suppressed violence, but in him telegraphed suppressed intelligence. The stillness of someone doing calculations you couldn't see. He had a habit of cracking his knuckles when he was processing disturbing information. Lieutenant Yara Osei was 27 and had been decorated twice for actions that her own after-action reports described in language so modest as to be nearly self-effacing, a quality that put her at odds with every promotion board she'd ever appeared before, and at no odds whatsoever with the soldiers she led, who would have followed her into the interior of a star. She had 3 small scars on her left jaw from a fragment that had come through the command vehicle's viewport during the Kessler engagement, and she touched them sometimes when she was thinking. Lieutenants Faro, Masende, Okonkwo, and Hess completed the ring, each of them selected by Haugen on criteria that Mara had only partly understood until she met them. They were all, in their different ways, people who had been wrong before and had not been destroyed by it. The Veth read the future like a book, she said. We're going to write a new chapter. She explained the block universe in terms they could use rather than terms that were technically precise. She drew the circles in the dirt again, the probable space, the improbable margin, the gap between them where models broke down. She talked about the wine glass. She talked about entropy. Osi touched her jaw scars throughout. Brennis cracked his knuckles twice. Then she explained the plan. 4 components explained in reverse order of insanity. First, randomized communication. Not encrypt. The Veth had cracked every encryption protocol within a week of first contact, demonstrating a cryptanalytic capability that suggested their temporal perception extended to predicting the logic chains of human coders. Randomize. Send false orders, contradictory orders, orders in dead languages pulled from the UEF's linguistic archive, orders describing retreats that became advances, positions that were never held, Artillery missions called on their own lines and redirected at the last moment. Not to deceive, the Veth would perceive the tactical intent behind the deception if the deception followed rational patterns. The point was to inject entropy into the signal itself, to be the shattered wine glass in the communications network. Second, decouple action from intent. Every soldier in the assault force would know only their own objective. No one below platoon commander would know the overall plan, and the platoon commanders themselves would not know each other's objectives. Objectives would be assigned by lottery, randomized by a physical dice roll, documented and sealed, opened only at H-hour, 12 minutes before the assault began. The reasoning was simple and felt slightly insane the first time she said it aloud. If the Veth read futures by reading probable intentions, then an army that didn't know its own intentions had no coherent future to read. They would be reading the probabilistic outputs of 1,200 individual decision loops, none of which connected to any other, none of which formed the kind of coordinated pattern that a future reader could synthesize into tactical intelligence. Third, the motion paradox. She'd read the xenophysics reports 3 times to make sure she understood this well enough to explain it. The Veth's temporal perception appeared to be a function of their nervous system interacting with the local geometry of space-time. Specifically, with the local curvature of space-time produced by mass and motion. Einstein's general relativity, the version her mother had loved best, said that massive objects bent the fabric of space-time, the way a bowling ball bent the surface of a trampoline. The Veth apparently felt those bends the way a normal person felt wind, and a rapidly moving large mass, say, a resupply shuttle making a low-altitude burn over the eastern approach at precisely row 400, would create a localized space-time distortion, tiny and technically measurable, like a thumbprint pressed into the trampoline surface, moving fast and then gone. In isolation, it would mean nothing. Combined with everything else, it might cause the Veth's temporal perception to smear, just slightly, just enough, the way a gyroscope wobbled on an uneven surface. It wouldn't blind them, but it might make them squint. She paused here, looked around the circle of faces in the pre-dawn dark. The fourth component, she said, requires a volunteer. There was a moment, she could see it cross their faces, where every one of the 6 platoon commanders did the math, heard the word volunteer, and subtracted everything she'd already described and arrived at the thing she hadn't said yet. Lieutenant Brennis spoke first. He cracked his knuckles. "You need someone to do something so insane that the Veth can't model it at all," he said. "Something so far outside probability that it doesn't appear in their window." "Yes. What kind of insane are we talking about?" Mara looked at the maps spread on the rock face behind her, the red line that marked the Veth defensive perimeter. The single point on that perimeter where the terrain compressed into a narrow pass between 2 basalt ridges, a choke point that the Veth were defending with 3 gun emplacements, and what the telemetry suggested was a command node. The command node that processed, coordinated, and distributed the temporal sensing data across their entire line. "There's a cliff," she said, 80 meters above the pass. "It's directly above the command node. If you drop a sufficient charge from that height onto the node, you destroy their ability to share temporal intelligence across the line. The entire Veth defensive perimeter goes tactically blind simultaneously, and our assault teams walk through the gaps in the time it takes them to reorganize." Silence pooled in the dark between them. "The cliff," said O.C. quietly, "is 400 meters inside the Veth perimeter." "Yes. Getting to that cliff would require going through the Veth line." "Yes, which they would see coming. They would see the probable version of it coming," Mara said. "The version where a soldier approaches tactically, using cover, using concealment, using every trained instinct that military science has ever developed." She let that sit. That version they'd drop before the first ridge. Brennis was still. But if someone went through completely stupidly, not stupidly, randomly, no pattern, no cover, no concealment, no tactical logic of any kind. Moving only by, she reached into her vest pocket and produced a small object. Dice roll, direction, dice, distance, dice, timing, dice, every decision made by pure chance, with no rational agency that their models could extrapolate from. She set the dice on the rock between them. Everyone stared at them. 2 standard 6-sided dice, worn at the edges, one of them with a small chip in the corner of the foreface. She'd been carrying them since. The Meridian. A habit she'd inherited from her father, who'd believed in having something in your pocket that you could touch, when you needed to remind yourself, that chance was still a real thing in the universe. That person would probably die, Brenna said. Yes, but the uncertainty of how they moved might create enough noise in the Veth perimeter sensors that the command node can't clearly perceive. Anything, Mara finished. For approximately 4 to 7 minutes, based on Central's modeling, the node would be processing so much contradictory temporal data from a completely anomalous input source that it would effectively lock, like a probability engine trying to calculate the trajectory of a coin flip that keeps changing which face it will land on. Brennis looked at the dice for a long time. Then he looked at her. "I'll do it," he said. "No," said Mara and picked them up. "I will." Haugen tried to talk her out of it. He tried in the command tent, and then he tried again outside the command tent, and then he walked her to the perimeter wire and tried there, and she let him try all 3 times because it was the right thing to do, and because she respected him, and because she had already decided, with the quiet finality of a door closing, that she was the only person who should do this. Not because she was the best soldier. Brennis might have been, or Osi. Not because she was most expendable. She was a sergeant. There were privates for that math. Because she understood what she was being asked to become. Not a weapon, not a sacrifice. A piece of noise in a universe that wanted to be signal. An unpredictable input in a cosmos that the Veth understood as already written. She was going to walk into the future that they could read, and she was going to carry with her a randomness so complete, so genuinely unhuman, that it would be, in the truest sense, a new chapter they hadn't memorized. She'd been thinking about the block universe again, about the idea that past, present, and future all existed simultaneously, that the universe was a 4-dimensional object and time was just the direction you moved through it. The Veth believed this not as a theory, but as an experienced reality. Felt. The future was as real to them as the past, as solid as settled. They moved through it the way a reader moved through a book they'd already finished. But the book had to be written first, before the Big Bang, and she'd thought about this on the Meridian. As a child, lying on her back on the painted sky floor of the habitat ring, there had been nothing. Then there had been a point. Infinitely dense, infinitely ordered, everything compressed into a single thing that contained all possibilities simultaneously. And then, explosion, disorder, entropy. The universe shattering outward from that perfect compressed moment into irreversible, unstoppable, magnificent chaos. The Veth loved order. They perceived the future, because the universe tended, from moment to moment, toward the most probable configuration. Entropy increasing, but doing so along predictable gradients, the glass falling and shattering in the predicted directions. They were riding the thermodynamic current of a cosmos that preferred the probable. Mara Voss had been born on a ship that was the compressed point of a new civilization. She had watched her parents die in the first disordered expansion of contact with something alien and hostile. She had spent her adult life learning how to be the most efficiently lethal version of the probable thing. Tonight she was going to be the shattering wine glass. She checked her kit one final time by feel in the dark of the forward staging area. Charge, secured in the vest's interior pocket with 2 redundant attachments. Dice loose in the left exterior pocket, accessible with one hand. Sidearm, holstered. No rifle, too heavy for what the dice might require, and the presence of a long weapon would register as combat posture, which was itself a pattern. She dressed light and random. No helmet, just a patrol cap, because helmets meant assault and assault meant intention. A jacket 2 sizes too large that she'd borrowed from a supply corporal without explanation. Old boots, resoled 3 times, with the uneven wear pattern of someone who walked slightly supinated. Something that had never mattered until now, when even the impression of footsteps in the soil might constitute a readable signature. She stood at the wire and let herself be afraid for exactly 30 seconds. She'd found this useful over the years. A finite acknowledgement of the fear, boxed and timed, so it didn't have to follow her into the work. 28, 29, 30. She cracked the dice in her palm, felt their familiar weight, and stepped out of the wire. The dice said, "Go left." She went left. She went left through 30 meters of black scrub that tore at her trousers, and then the dice said, "Stop, wait, 42 seconds." She counted to 42 with her face pressed against cold rock, and the Veth patrol passing 12 meters to her right, moving in that awful, unhurried way that meant they had already seen every ambush she might run and found none of them likely enough to worry about. The patrol comprised 3 soldiers. She could smell them, Not unpleasant exactly, more like ozone and something warm and mineral, like fresh stone exposed to air. They moved without looking at each other, without speaking, their triple-jointed limbs finding each step with a precision that was not graceful exactly, but was profoundly, deeply economical. The movement of beings who never made an unnecessary gesture because they always knew which gestures would be necessary. They moved past her without looking. Then the dice said, "Go forward." She went forward. The first 100 meters were the worst because the rational part of her brain, the part that had been trained for 11 years to read terrain and assess risk and select cover, kept screaming. It screamed at every exposed crossing. It screamed when the dice told her to stand upright in a shallow basin with no cover overhead and wait for 27 seconds. It screamed hardest when she had to cross an open 30-meter stretch of pale gravel that reflected the moonlight like a stage, and her every instinct said, "Go back, go around, go anywhere but here." And instead she walked, not ran, not sprinted, not crawled, walked, because the dice said walk, stepping steadily across the gravel in full view of a Veth gun emplacement 400 meters to the east. The gun did not fire. She understood why. The Veth gunner had seen 1,000 futures in which a human soldier crossed that gravel, and in all of them the soldier used cover, used concealment, used the tactical intelligence that 11 years of UEF training produced. The probability of a human simply walking across the open was so low, so far outside the weighted prediction window, that the model had essentially filed it under cosmic noise. It could not compute what it could not predict. She crossed the gravel, reached the far side, pressed against a boulder, let her heart be whatever it needed to be. The dice said. She went right, and the mission became a kind of communion with randomness that she had no vocabulary for until later, when she tried to write it down and found that the language of war didn't cover it, and the language of physics covered only the mechanism, and not the experience. She moved the way water moved, or rather the way water would move if water had no geography to follow, without the logic of the lowest point, without the gravity channel of the obvious path. The dice took her east when tactical sense said north. They stopped her for 97 seconds beside a Veth defensive emplacement, while 2 soldiers cleaned their equipment not 4 meters away, stopped her utterly still. And she stood there and breathed and watched the aliens she was trying to break run maintenance on hardware that would kill her in a moment if they looked, and she felt, very distinctly, the sensation of time doing the thing her mother had described, not flowing but simply being, each moment as fixed and real as every other. The moment of her death equally real in the 4-dimensional geometry of space-time, whether it happened in the next 4 seconds or in 50 years. She was inside the block universe. She was experiencing it the way the Veth experienced it. The difference was she chose to act anyway. The command node was a hexagonal structure roughly 4 meters tall, built from the same dark composite material as all Veth architecture, designed to absorb light and heat and the casual attentions of anything that might find it interesting. It sat in the narrow floor of the pass between 2 basalt ridges, half buried in the rock, its surfaces scored with the angular patterns that Veth engineers used the way human engineers used wiring diagrams. Even at ground level, looking up at it from 20 meters out, she could feel it. A faint subsonic hum that seemed to pass through her chest rather than her ears, as though the node were broadcasting not in sound but in the vibration of space-time itself. She understood what it was doing. The Veth's temporal perception wasn't magic and wasn't mysticism. It was biology and physics, a nervous system so finely tuned to the local curvature of space-time that it could, in effect, read the near future directly from the geometry of the universe. The command node was an amplifier and a network hub. It took the individual perceptions of every Veth soldier within range, all those private futures, those overlapping probability branches, and unified them into a single shared picture. A tactical God's eye view of what was about to happen. A book written in the language of space-time curvature, continuously updated, permanently available. Everything inside the node's range knew what was coming. Everything inside its range moved through time like a reader moved through a familiar story, not experiencing it exactly, just following it to the conclusion that was already known. She reached into her vest and found the charge. Standard demolition block, military issue, nothing special, just a fat brick of high explosive composite with a 5-second delay fuse. The kind of thing you used to bring down a bridge or open a door that objected to being opened. She had carried it for 400 meters through an enemy perimeter, following dice roll instructions, walking across open ground in the dark, and the charge had remained cool and inert and patient in its pocket, a potential that awaited only decision. The dice said, "Wait." She waited. Something happened above her on the ridge to the left. A small sound, the shift of loose stone, the soft impact of something landing on the rock. Her head came up and she looked, and a Veth sentry was standing on the ridge 20 meters above her, looking down into the pass, scanning in that methodical sweep that Veth perimeter guards used. The sentry looked directly at her. The moment stretched. In the block universe her mother had described, this moment existed alongside all the others. The moment she'd been born, the moment she'd stood at the observation post, watching Veth gun crews move before the orders were submitted, the moment her parents had died on Briar in the first terrible weeks of contact. All of them equally real, equally present, laid out in the four-dimensional landscape of space-time, like a map of everywhere she had ever been. The sentry's gaze moved across her and kept moving. The sentry saw her and did not see her. The sentry's temporal perception swept the position, found nothing in its probability map that corresponded to the pattern of input she was generating. A human standing still in an exposed location, with no weapon posture and no tactical logic, and classified her as noise. She was so unpredictable that she had become invisible. The dice said, "Now." She moved, 4 steps to the base of the node. Her hands knew the charge without looking at it. Finger through the pull ring, safety tab between thumb and forefinger, 1 second to arm it. She was aware, in a detached way, of the battle beginning behind her. The shuttle burning low overhead, its engines carving a thermal scar across the sky and the space-time under it that would, if Central's models were right, cause every Veth in the line to feel a sudden queasy uncertainty, like a reader whose page had blurred mid-sentence. She was aware of the first sounds of the ground assault, the flat crack of suppressed rifle fire, then the deeper concussions of the breaching charges on the eastern flank, then the radio chatter fragmenting into a dozen overlapping voices, every one of them calling objectives that bore no rational relationship to each other because Brennus had rolled his dice and Osi had rolled hers, and the assault was coming in every direction at once. A thermodynamic explosion with no coherent source, an event so disordered that no future reader in the history of the universe could have predicted its exact shape. She pressed the charge against the node's surface. The composite hummed against her palm. Somewhere inside it, the future was being calculated, recalculated, revised, and she felt very distinctly the sensation of something vast and alien trying to look at her and failing, not failing to see her physically, failing to place her in any probabilistic context. She didn't exist in its model. She was the Big Bang before the first particle had decided where to go. Pure undifferentiated potential, unresolvable into prediction. She pulled the ring. She ran. The dice were in her pocket. She didn't consult them. There was no time for dice now and no need for them either. The tactical camouflage of pure randomness had served its purpose and now she just ran, flat out, lungs burning, the instincts that had been screaming at her for the last 40 minutes finally given their head. Every trained reflex engaged, serpentining across the pass floor heading for the eastern ridge, because the assault teams would be coming through the eastern gap and the eastern gap was the closest cover, and the charge had 5 seconds, and she had covered perhaps 20 meters when the charge went off. She felt it before she heard it, a pressure wave that picked her up and deposited her 6 meters further along the pass floor with her face in the gravel and her ears full of a sound like the universe rearranging its furniture. She lay still for a half second, ran a fast inventory of herself, and found everything still connected. Something had hit her left shoulder, not hard enough to be shrapnel, more like being pushed by a large rude hand. Her ears rang. Her vision doubled and then halved and then resolved into one picture, moderately reliable. She got up. The command node was gone. In its place was a blackened crater in the basalt, shot through with cracks of that peculiar Veth orange that appeared whenever their technology was forcibly powered down, like bioluminescence, like something alive going out. The hum was gone. The subsonic certainty of it was gone. The air where it had been felt lighter, in a way that had nothing to do with pressure and everything to do with the absence of that feeling she'd had, standing close to it, the feeling of being looked at by something that knew what you were going to do before you did it. Across the pass, across the entire eastern line, she heard it, the sound of the Veth losing the future. It was not the sound she'd expected. She'd expected chaos, panic, the noise of an army that suddenly found itself fighting blind. What she heard instead was silence, a profound, spreading, awful silence, as though the Veth line had drawn a single collective breath and couldn't find the next one. And then, slower than she'd expected, the sound of the Veth reorganizing without coordination, individual units responding to immediate threat in the way that any competent soldiers respond, but without the seamless collective intelligence of the future sight, without the ability to look at a map and read the outcomes in advance. Then the assault teams came through the gap. She found Cale Brennis near the secondary breach on the eastern ridge, 6 hours later, in the gray light of a morning that came slowly and without ceremony over the Tesserine Plateau. He had blood on his left sleeve and a strip of emergency bandage wound around his right hand, but he was standing, which was more than could be said for the 2 Veth gun crews whose emplacements he'd taken with a handful of privates and a level of tactical creativity that the after-action report would later describe as unconventional, and which had involved, Mara gathered from a Daise's account, a flanking approach that had begun as a dice roll direction and ended with Brennis personally dragging a field gun 200 meters to a position from which it could fire on its former crew. "You made it," he said. "Was there doubt?" He looked at her sideways. "You walked across 200 meters of open ground with no cover in the middle of an active Veth perimeter, using dice." "The dice," she said, "were the point." He didn't answer that for a moment. Around them, the sounds of the remaining engagement were fading, sporadic fire from the northern end of the pass, the occasional deep percussion of a demo charge, but mostly now the sounds of aftermath, equipment being cataloged, wounded being moved, the quiet, efficient voices of soldiers who had done the hard thing and were now doing the necessary thing. Yu was sitting against a rock 15 meters away, writing in the small notebook she always carried, recording trajectories with the same instinct she used to calculate them. "Did it work because of the physics?" Brennis asked. "The randomness? Or was it just, did we just get lucky?" Mara thought about this seriously. She owed him a serious answer. "Both," she said. "The physics gave us the mechanism. Injecting entropy into a system that operates on predictability. That's real, that's not a metaphor. But the luck," she paused. "The luck was that humans are random. We don't have to fake it. We just had to stop suppressing it." He absorbed this. "That's almost philosophical." "I grew up on a generation ship," she said. "We had a lot of time to philosophize." He almost smiled. Then he did smile, and she saw the age it subtracted from his face. 23 down to something younger, something that hadn't learned yet to keep the relief locked up as a matter of professional dignity. She watched him smile and felt her own chest loosen by a fraction. Around them, the planet Briar did its autumn thing with the red scrub and the silver moons and the black basalt going warm in the early light. And somewhere in the distance, a bird that wasn't a bird, one of the local equivalents, 6-limbed, yellow-billed, with a call like a struck tuning fork, began its morning. The debrief lasted 3 days. Not the tactical debrief that took 4 hours, was efficient and brutal, and produced 17 pages of after-action notes that were already, before the ink was dry, being transmitted to every UEF command in the theater. The longer debrief was the one that happened in the evenings, in Haugen's command tent, with a bottle of something that the 7th Expeditionary's quartermaster called whiskey, and which bore only a philosophical relationship to the concept. Mara, Haugen, Brennis, Osi, and 2 of the other platoon commanders sat around the folding table while the maps were rolled away and talked about what had happened in the way soldiers talk when the shooting is over and the thinking begins. Not strategy, not doctrine, but the harder thing underneath, the question of what it meant. "They're already adapting," Osi said on the second evening. She had a datapad in front of her showing intercepts from the northern theater, where the Veth were massing for what Central assessed as a counter-push. The ones who weren't at the pass. They've changed their perimeter protocols. Tighter spacing, more redundant nodes, smaller probability windows per node so that any one distortion can't lock the whole network. "They saw it coming," Brennis said. "They saw the result coming. The attack on the node. They just couldn't see the path to it." Osi set the pad down. "So now they're closing the paths." Lieutenant Masende, who had been quiet through most of the evening, poured himself a second measure of the not whiskey and said, "So we've got maybe 2 campaigns before they've adapted enough to close the advantage." He had the flat, unsentimental voice of a man who dealt in honest assessments. "We gave them a look at the mechanism. Now they'll build against it." "Yes," Mara said. And when they do, we'll find the new gap. How? If they've closed the probability window, they can't close it entirely. They can narrow it. They can make it more robust, more redundant, less susceptible to a single disruption event. But they cannot make themselves infallible at reading the future of a species that doesn't know its own future. She leaned forward. The fundamental asymmetry remains. We're genuinely indeterminate. They're not. The window they use to read us is an approximation of us, not us. And we change. Every time they build a better approximation, we've already drifted past it, because we're not a stable system. We're changing constantly, individually and collectively, in ways that are intrinsic to what we are. She thought about what her mother had said about entropy, about the universe moving from the perfect compressed order of the Big Bang toward ever-increasing disorder, and how that disorder was not a fall from grace, but the mechanism by which everything that had ever happened had happened. Disorder was how stars formed. Disorder was how planets cooled and oceans filled and single-celled organisms found themselves, against all reasonable probability, becoming something that eventually built generation ships and named planets and made war and made peace and looked at the sky and wondered what was coming. The reason this worked today isn't that we found a specific trick they can't counter, she said. It's that we found a property of humanity that they can't model. We're not a billiard ball system. We're not predictable. The Veth have been fighting us as though we were, because every civilized species in the catalog apparently is. She picked up her glass, but we evolved in chaos. We came out of the primordial mess on a planet that could have gone 1,000 different ways. And what survived wasn't the thing that was most efficient. It was the thing that was most adaptable. The thing that could respond to a universe that didn't give you a script. She drank. The not whiskey tasted like fermented ambition and regret, which was perhaps more honest than good whiskey. They've been reading our future, she said. From now on, we make sure we don't have one worth reading. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of the war. The 7th Expeditionary adopted what the unit's wags had taken to calling the Voss Protocol, though Mara herself had never called it anything. It wasn't a protocol so much as a philosophy, and the best way to understand it was to understand what it wasn't. It wasn't chaos for its own sake. Pure chaos, random movement with no objective, no coordination, no purpose, was as predictable as tactical precision in its own way, because it produced no outcomes that required adaptation. Chaos that went nowhere was a null input. The Veth could not see where you were going if you weren't going anywhere, but they could see where you weren't, and the absence of threat was as useful to a future reader as the presence of one. What the protocol was instead was informed randomness. The technique of introducing genuine chance dice, card draws, coin flips, even the outputs of a thermal noise generator that Corporal Adieze had wired together from salvaged components, and which everyone called the Oracle, at every decision point where prediction and planning overlapped. Not all decisions, not the ones with only one viable answer, but the ones that held multiple viable answers in tension. Which route, which timing, which element leads the assault, which reserve is committed first. Those decisions were surrendered to chance. The effect on the Veth was, over those 6 weeks, measurable. Response times lengthened. Repositioning frequency increased. A sign, Central's analyst said, that the Veth perimeter commanders were revising their probability models more often, updating their read of the future faster, because the future kept failing to arrive in the predicted form. 3 times, Veth units withdrew from positions that UEF forces never actually advanced on, apparently because the probability window had shown an attack that the dice had then decided not to make. They were expending energy fighting futures that didn't happen. Mara filed reports, wrote analyses, got called into 3 separate video conferences with officers senior enough that she had to iron her uniform first. She was patient in these meetings, answered questions directly, didn't oversell or undersell, and remained calmly unimpressed by the presence of stars on someone's collar, because stars on a collar were a rank, not an argument, and she had stopped being intimidated by ranks the day she'd walked across 200 meters of open gravel at night while an alien army tried to read her future and couldn't. The question everyone keeps asking, she said in the 3rd of these conferences, to a general whose name she'd already forgotten, but whose face held the particular expression of someone managing competing pressures from above, is whether we can scale this. Can we do it across a front, across multiple theaters? Can it be the doctrine for the whole war? She paused. It can. but not if we try to systematize it. The moment this becomes a system, a checklist, a protocol, a thing that every soldier does the same way in response to the same stimuli, it becomes predictable. The Veth adapt. They always adapt. What we're doing isn't giving them a problem to solve. We're being a kind of problem they can't solve. That requires staying genuinely random. The general stared at her. "Sir Sergeant," he said, "are you telling me the key to winning a war against a species that can see the future is to be spontaneous?" "With respect, sir," she said, "I'm telling you the key is to be human." There was a conversation she had with you that she thought about later, on the transport, on the station, in the years after when she was teaching, rather than fighting, and the war had become something that happened to other people's children. You had come to find her on the third morning after the pass, when the camp was settling back into its operational rhythms, and the immediate aftermath had been processed, and what remained was the longer business of incorporating what had happened into how they understood the war. You was 19 and had the quality that Mara had seen once before in her life, in a young physicist on the Meridian, who had become the Meridian's chief navigator. The quality of thinking about things from the inside, of not being satisfied with external descriptions but needing to feel the mechanism from within. "I've been thinking about the dice," you said. "Tell me, when you were crossing the perimeter, rolling the dice and following them." You sat down on the basalt shelf across from where Mara was eating breakfast, reconstituted protein and something that approximated coffee if you'd never had real coffee and were willing to generalize. You weren't actually random. The dice were random, but you were still choosing to follow them. That's a decision, a rational decision to surrender rational decision-making. The Veth could, in theory, model that meta-decision. Mara considered this, you're right. So why did it work? Because the meta-decision to follow the dice doesn't tell them where the dice will land. She set down the reconstituted protein. The decision to be random is the rational layer they can see. But randomness is, in physics, genuinely unpredictable at the base level. Quantum mechanics, thermal noise, the exact aerodynamic behavior of tumbling polyhedra, these things aren't predictable even in principle. Not because of cognitive limitations, but because the universe, at its fundamental level, doesn't determine outcomes until they happen. You was quiet for a moment. The future isn't written. The probable future is written. The actual future is being written. Right now, by dice falls and quantum events and the precise way the wind catches a falling object. She paused. The Veth experience the most probable future, as if it's the only future. They're not wrong that it's the most probable. They're wrong that it's inevitable. That's the same mistake Newton made, you said. He thought if you knew every particle's position and velocity, you could calculate the entire future of the universe. And then quantum mechanics showed that you can't, that the universe has genuine randomness built in at the fundamental level, that the act of observation changes the observed. Mara nodded. The Veth evolved before quantum mechanics became militarily relevant. They're Newtonian perceivers in a quantum universe. You thought about this for a long time. That's almost comforting, she said finally. I find it exactly comforting, Mara said. The decisive engagement came in the 42nd week of what had become known, in the casual geography of military jargon, as the Corvette IV campaign. It came not in one action but in 7 simultaneous ones, across a front of 300 kilometers, on a day that a dice roll had selected from a pool of 7 candidate dates that had all been viable for the assault. Mara was not at the front for most of it. She was in a planning room 80 kilometers behind the line, feeding dice rolls into an assault matrix that looked, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, like a mathematical hallucination, a grid of objectives and timings and force allocations that had been generated not by military intelligence analysis but by a combination of rational constraint setting and pure chance. The constraints said, these objectives matter, these routes are viable, these forces are available. The chance said, here's which ones you're doing today. She monitored the feeds as the assault unfolded. The Veth responded, as always, with a precision that would have been devastating against a conventional assault. Units repositioned before the attack arrived. Gun crews elevated before the artillery missions were called. Reserve elements began moving 4 minutes before the flanking elements that would have necessitated them had even committed. But the attack wasn't going where they'd repositioned. It was going everywhere else. The probability window, the future that the Veth were reading, defending, trying to meet, was a ghost. It was the weighted average of 100 plans that hadn't been chosen, the composite future of an army that had surrendered its own certainty in order to deny that certainty to its enemy. The Veth were not defending against what was happening. They were defending against what probably would happen, and probably, this time, was wrong. She watched the telemetry, watched the Veth line flex and strain and fold along lines that corresponded to nothing in their probability models. Watched 3 assault teams reach objectives in under their projected times because the defense that should have been there had shifted to cover a threat that the dice had decided not to threaten. Watched one unit take 30% casualties against a hardened node that the dice had, nonetheless said to hit. Because some things cost you even when you're right about the method, and the universe doesn't love you just because you've understood it a little better than yesterday. She wrote that in her notebook later. The way the universe didn't love you for understanding it. There was something almost theological about it. The Veth had been operating as though the cosmos was, at its heart, legible, as though the future was a text to be read, defended, exploited. Their entire civilization, she suspected, was built around the idea that the universe was a book already written. That time was a direction you moved through a pre-existing landscape, that the end was known before the beginning. Humans had built their civilization on the opposite premise, not that the future was unknowable. Human history was full of prophets and soothsayers and economists, but that it was undetermined, that the next moment hadn't happened yet, that what you did in this moment genuinely made the next one, rather than merely arriving at it. She believed both were partially true. She believed the Veth were right about the architecture of space-time. The block universe was real. The past and future existed simultaneously in the 4-dimensional structure of reality. She believed time as a flow was, as her mother had explained and as Brian Greene had spent his career demonstrating, an artifact of consciousness rather than a feature of physics. She believed all of it. And she believed it didn't matter, because the experience was real, even if the illusion was real, because you lived in the illusion the way you lived in your own skin, not as a choice but as a condition. And the condition of being human was to not know what was coming, to face an open future, to act without a script. The Veth had evolved to use the book, humanity had evolved to write it. Both were valid strategies for surviving a universe that was, at its base level, 13 billion years of matter, getting gradually more disordered. But only one strategy worked when the opponent had already read your ending. The formal Veth withdrawal from Korvath IV began 12 days after the assault. It was not a rout. The Veth were too disciplined for a rout, too unflappable. Even now, even with the campaign breaking against them, they moved in those measured, unhurried ways, each soldier settling into the next action with the serenity of a being who had already experienced it. What changed was the math, not the individual engagements but the aggregate, the growing tally of objectives not held, positions abandoned to threats that hadn't arrived as predicted, reserves committed to futures that turned out to be dice rolls rather than intentions. They were losing not because they had been outfought. They had been outfought plenty of times. The UEF's casualty rolls were a long, ugly document. They were losing because the war had become, for them, unreadable. And a species that navigated reality by reading the future was not well equipped for a war that had stopped having one. Mara watched them go from the observation post above Camp Curran, the same scope, the same basalt shelf, the same cold November wind coming down off the plateau. The Veth columns moved in their characteristic silence, orderly, unhurried. But there was something different about them now that she couldn't quite isolate until she'd been watching for 20 minutes. They looked up, that was it. Periodically, not constantly, not obsessively, but with a regularity that she'd never seen in 6 months of watching them, individual. Veth soldiers in the withdrawing columns would look up, not at the sky, not at any specific point, just up. The way a person looked up when they felt the first drop of rain and weren't sure if it was rain or something else. When the familiar had become uncertain, they were looking for a future they could no longer see. She felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but that occupied the same space where those two things blurred together. The Veth were not evil. That had been one of the first casualties of the war. The comfortable idea that the enemy was evil was monstrous, was defined by a malevolence that made the killing clean. The Veth were not evil. They were a species that had developed a remarkable ability and built a civilization around it. And that civilization had brought them here, to this world, to this campaign, to a conflict they had entered with every expectation of reading its conclusion before it was written. They had not expected to meet a species for whom the conclusion was always, by definition, unwritten. She lowered the scope, made a small mark in her notebook, a notation she'd been keeping for months, a running count that she'd shared with no one, that no after-action report would ever capture. The number of Veth soldiers she had watched look up, as though checking whether the future was still there. Haugen found her on the observation post at dusk, as the last Veth columns disappeared into the pass and the light went red over the plateau, and the planet called Briar bled its seasonal red from the black scrub the way it always did, with a slow and unassuming dignity. "Central wants to talk to you," he said. "I know. Not just the general this time. Someone higher." She looked at him. He had the expression he used when he was telling her something important, in a way that left room for her to decide how to receive it. "I'll take the meeting," she said. "Good." He was quiet for a moment, watching the pass fill with shadow. "Do you think they'll be back?" She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about all the things that mattered. "Yes," she said. "Different approach. Better models. They'll have been running analyses for as long as it took them to withdraw, trying to reconstruct what happened, to identify patterns in what we did. They're good at patterns, but we're not patterns," she said. "We're people." She paused. "Every time they build a model of us, it starts to go stale the moment they finish building it. Because we're not the same as we were. We learn, we change, we surprise ourselves. We do things we didn't know we were going to do. We grieve and we laugh at the wrong moments, and we walk across open ground in the dark with dice in our pockets because something in us decided that was the thing to do." She turned from the pass and looked at him. "That's not a vulnerability. That's the point." Haugen considered this, nodded once, the small decisive nod of a man who had thought it through and arrived somewhere useful. "You should write this up," he said. "Not the tactical debrief, the other thing, the philosophy." She left Corvathor V 4 months later, on a transport that smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and 200 bodies sharing a space designed for 150. She had a data pad full of notes and a field notebook full of dice rolls, and an order cutting her to the UEF Strategic Development Command on the station that orbited the primary. She also had, folded in her left breast pocket, a letter she had written to a Veth officer whose name, translated badly through the xenolinguistic software, came out as something like, "She who reads the river." She'd found the name in a captured comms archive, attached to a string of command node transmissions from the early stages of the campaign. She who reads the river had been the Veth perimeter commander at the pass. She'd been the one trying to coordinate the defense that Mara's walk across the gravel had broken. The letter would never be delivered. There was no protocol for it, no address for it, no precedent in the history of this war for a human sergeant writing a letter to a Veth commander. But Mara had written it anyway, because the urge to write it was real, and the act of suppressing real urges was a habit she was trying to break. "I think you understood what happened," the letter said. "I think you saw it from inside. The moment the model stopped working, the moment the futures you'd been reading went silent. I think it must have felt like going blind. I'm not sorry. I would do it again. But I want you to know that I understand what we took from you, and I don't think it was nothing. The ability to see the future is extraordinary. I grew up being told that the present moment was the only thing we had, that the future was unwritten, that uncertainty was the price of being alive. I used to find that frightening. I don't anymore. There is something your physics says that mine agrees with. Every moment that has ever happened still exists. The past is not gone. It persists in the structure of space-time, real and fixed, as certain as mathematics. This moment, me writing this on a transport heading away from Corvath Fourth, is permanent. It will always have happened. Whatever comes next, this will be part of the record. I don't know if that's comfort or just information. I offer it as both. I hope the river is still readable, wherever you are." She sealed the letter in its fold and pressed it flat against her ribs and leaned her head against the viewport and watched the planet called Briar turn below her, its surface red and black in the morning light, its pass and its ridges and its basalt shelves and the painted sky camp where she'd spent 6 months watching an alien army read the future and finally failed to read hers. She arrived at the station on a Tuesday, which was a distinction without much meaning in deep space. but which the station maintained because humans maintain such things, the same way the meridian had maintained a day-night cycle and seasonal lighting changes and a painted sky, not because the body needed them strictly, but because consciousness needed them, because the stories we told about time were part of how we survived the reality of it. The station was called Harbor. It orbited the primary, the star around which Briar and its sister planets described their ancient circuits, at a distance that put it above the most active debris field and below the optimal insertion corridor for transiting vessels, which meant that it was always, at any given hour, receiving or dispatching something. The constant movement, the continuous churn of arrivals and departures, gave it the feeling of a place that never quite stopped to take its own temperature, and Mara found this congenial. She had never been comfortable in places that were too still. Her quarters were smaller than the observation post at Camp Curran, which was saying something. A bunk, a desk, a sealed viewport that looked out onto the primary's light reflected in the debris field. Shards of old rock and older ice catching the light and giving it back changed, softened, distributed. She sat at the desk on the first night and opened her field notebook and wrote for 3 hours without stopping. She wrote it the way her mother had explained entropy, clearly, carefully, with patience for the large and unkind ideas. She wrote about the block universe, the physicist's view of time as a four-dimensional landscape in which all moments existed simultaneously, the present no more privileged than the past or future, the sensation of time's passage, an artifact of consciousness navigating the four-dimensional terrain. She wrote about what it meant for a species to evolve consciousness that accessed this landscape directly, to feel the future the way a human felt the memory of yesterday, not as prophecy, not as vision, but as lived experience, as known fact. She wrote about entropy, about the arrow of time, about the Big Bang's initial compression, everything ordered, everything in its place, the perfect crystal of the universe's beginning, and the slow magnificent explosion of disorder that had been happening for 13 billion years since. About how the arrow of time pointed not because physics required it, but because entropy did, because disorder increased, because the universe moved from the one possible ordered configuration toward the vast, incomprehensible number of disordered ones, and this movement was the clock by which everything lived. She wrote about the Veth, who had evolved in a stable, ancient, geologically quiet system, and who had developed over millions of years a nervous architecture so finely tuned to the thermodynamic gradients of space-time that they could read the near future directly from the local curvature of reality, who had built their civilization around this ability, who had never, in all their long history, encountered a species that was genuinely random at a deep level, a species whose evolutionary history was chaos, whose survival had depended not on prediction, but on adaptation, who carried in their biology and their culture and their daily thought a resistance to determinism that was itself a kind of weapon. She wrote about the dice, not as a tactical tool but as a symbol. The dice were not the point. The dice were a way of accessing something that was already true, that human choice, at its base level, was not perfectly predictable, that the consciousness that made the choice was not a simple calculating engine, that there was something in the machinery of human decision-making that was not reducible to prior states, that had genuine contingency, that produced outcomes which were not even in principle fully computable in advance. This was not mysticism, it was physics. Quantum mechanics had established, in the century before contact, that the universe had genuine randomness built into its foundations, that the act of observation affected the observed, that particles existed in superpositions of states until measurement collapsed them into single outcomes, and that this collapse was not determined by any prior state but was genuinely, irreducibly random. Human consciousness, built from quantum biological machinery, participated in this randomness. Human choice emerged from a substrate that the universe had chosen, for its own deep reasons, not to predetermine. The Veth had no such randomness in their architecture. Their nervous systems were exquisitely sensitive to the macroscopic probabilities of space-time but were not, it appeared, connected to the quantum indeterminacy that underlay those macroscopic probabilities. They read the book with perfect clarity, but the book was written in a language that was ultimately, at its deepest level, unwritten. Mara wrote for 3 hours, and then stopped and looked at what she'd produced and thought, "This is the most important thing I will ever write, and almost nobody will read it in time for it to matter. And that is how it goes with important things." She filed it with Central's Xenocognition Division, where it would be read by 6 people and cited by 12 more and quietly become the theoretical foundation for what the UEF would call, in the years following the Corvitha-4 campaign, the adaptive uncertainty doctrine. The doctrine that said, don't try to be unpredictable in specific ways. Be genuinely uncertain. Embrace the parts of yourself that don't know what comes next. Let the quantum clay of your consciousness do the thing it was built to do. Be human. Irreducibly, stubbornly, improbably human. There was one more thing she wrote that night that didn't go into any report. She wrote it in the field notebook, on the page after the running count of Veth soldiers she'd watched look up. She wrote it small and without a header, the way you write the things you're not ready to explain. My mother said, the flow of time is an illusion. We are all at every moment in every moment simultaneously. The past is as real as the present. The future is as real as the past. I believe her. I have believed her since I was 12, lying on the painted sky floor of the Meridian's habitat ring, looking up at a ceiling that was someone's sincere approximation of a sky they'd never seen. And I believe this too. The illusion is worth living in. The experience of time as a river, the sense that this moment is the only moment, that what I do here is not merely arriving at a pre-existing outcome, but genuinely making the next thing. This is not a mistake in the machinery. This is the machinery. This is how consciousness navigates a universe that is too complicated to experience raw. The Veth stood outside the river and read it from above. They knew the water. They knew the rocks. They knew every bend from source to sea. We swam it blind, not knowing what was around the next turn, sometimes drowning, sometimes finding a current that carried us somewhere we never expected. I know which one of us got where we were going, but I think I know which one of us had the better journey. She closed the notebook. Outside the viewport, the debris field caught the primary's light and distributed it in ways that were random and therefore beautiful. Each shard of rock and ice reflecting at its own angle, sending light in its own direction, the whole aggregate producing a shimmer that no calculation could have produced on purpose, that no future reader could have predicted, that was happening now and would always have happened. Fixed in the 4-dimensional record of space-time, alongside every other moment that had ever been. The transport had brought her here. The dice had brought her to the pass. Her mother's voice in her head had brought her to both. She thought about she who reads the river, somewhere on the other side of the withdrawal line, in whatever was left of the Veth command structure, running analysis on a campaign that had failed in ways their models had not predicted. She thought about those pale, triple-jointed figures in the withdrawing columns, looking up. She hoped they found something to read, and she hoped, in the same breath, that when they came back, which they would, which everything in their nature required them to do, they found that the humans they'd been fighting had not made the mistake of becoming predictable again. She hoped, in other words, that by the time they returned, the humans they'd modeled were already gone, replaced by the new version, the version that had learned and changed and surprised itself and done the irrational thing that no model could anticipate, the version that was still alive and still random and still stubbornly, irreducibly, magnificently uncertain about what it was going to do next. The transport burned for the station. Behind it, Briar turned in its orbit, patient and scarred and red-limbed in the autumn dark. Ahead, the future was unwritten. She opened her notebook and began. The meeting with Central took place 2 weeks after her arrival at Harbor, in a conference room that had been designed by someone who believed that beige was a neutral choice, and had not fully considered the psychological effects of long meetings in beige rooms. Mara wore her dress uniform for the first time in 6 months and found that it fit differently than she remembered, which was not a comment on her body, but on what her body now understood about itself. The officers present represented 3 separate commands and included the general from the video conference, whose name, she now knew, was General Arno Perec, and who had the slightly defensive air of someone who had been told their instincts were wrong by a sergeant, and had spent a month confirming that the sergeant was right. Also present, 2 admirals, one of whom was the kind of person who said nothing in meetings but whose silence had mass. A representative from the Xenocognition Division, who had the pale, slightly unfocused look of someone who spent most of their time in a relationship with abstract mathematics, and unexpectedly, a civilian. The civilian wore civilian clothes that were expensive in a way that communicated that the Expense was incidental, and turned out to be a theoretical physicist named Dr. Yasmin Achterberg, who had written 3 of the papers that Central's analysts had cited in their assessment of the Veth's temporal perception. Achterberg was the one who asked the questions that mattered. "You intuited the block universe connection without reading the literature," Achterberg said. She had a direct, unornamented way of speaking that Mara found immediately trustworthy. "Walk me through how." "I watched them," Mara said, "for 3 weeks. And I kept coming back to a specific quality in how they moved. They didn't react to events. They prepared for them before they happened. And the preparation wasn't frantic or improvisational. It was settled, as though the event were already in the past by the time they were preparing for it." Achterberg nodded slowly. "The block universe model describes time as a 4-dimensional spatial structure. For a being that navigated that structure differently than we do, that could, in effect, perceive along the time axis the way we perceive along spatial axes, the past and future would feel equivalent. Both would feel like memory, in a sense. Both would be equally accessible." "That's what the movement looked like," Mara said. "Memory, not anticipation. They weren't guessing what was coming. They were remembering it." "And the critical insight, the one about probability windows, how did you arrive at that?" Mara thought about the recon squad again. The 12 soldiers who died because they'd made the optimal choice, and the Veth had known they would make the optimal choice. "They weren't infallible," she said. "If they'd been reading the actual future rather than the most probable future, they wouldn't have made mistakes. But they did make mistakes. Small ones, and always in the direction of over-modeling rational behavior. They expected rational choices, and were almost always right. Because rational choices are the ones that efficient, well-trained minds converge on." "The probability window," Achterberg said. "A genuinely omniscient being would have seen the irrational approach coming. They didn't. Which meant they weren't reading all possible futures, just the most probable ones. Their perception was constrained by probability." Achterberg looked at General Perek. Something passed between them. "Surgeon Voss," Perek said, "we'd like to offer you a commission." She'd expected this. She'd been expecting it since the video conference, and she'd spent 2 weeks deciding how she felt about it, which turned out to be fine. She would still be the same person with a different collar. The dice would still roll the same way. "I'll take it," she said, on one condition. "Name it. I want a Days AU and Brennus assigned to my first posting. And I want to see the Veth xenobiology files, the full ones, not the redacted summary Central sends down to the line, the xenobiology files. They can see the future because of biology and physics," she said. "Their nervous system interacts with the local curvature of space-time. I want to know exactly how, because if we understand the mechanism precisely enough, we might find other ways to disrupt it." She paused. "And I want to know if there's anything we could do in reverse. Any way to develop, in humans, a limited version of what they do naturally." The room was quiet for a moment. Achterberg smiled. It was a very small smile, but it had depth to it. The smile of someone who had been waiting for a particular question and was glad it had finally arrived. "Now that," Achterberg said, "is going to be an interesting conversation." The xenobiology files took her 3 weeks to work through. Not because the information was dense, it was, but density had never been her obstacle, but because the implications kept requiring her to stop and think in the way that the body required rest, not as a failure of endurance but as a biological necessity. The Veth's temporal sense was rooted in a structure their biologists called the chronovial, a network of specialized neurons distributed throughout the nervous system that were, unlike standard neurons, magnetically sensitive to gravitomagnetic effects. Einstein's general relativity predicted that rotating masses dragged the space-time around them slightly, an effect called frame dragging, demonstrated on Earth by precision satellite measurements, and on Briar by the precise orbital corrections that the UEF's navigation systems had to apply because Briar's rotation rate created a local gravitomagnetic field that their instruments could detect. The Veth detected it directly, felt it the way a magnetoreceptive animal felt a magnetic field. And through the chronovial, they experienced the gradient of that field not as a static condition but as a direction, the direction of time. Every moment in the future was, in effect, a slightly different gravitomagnetic configuration than the present, and the Veth nervous system could read those configurations with sufficient precision to distinguish probable near-future states from less probable ones. The range was approximately 70 seconds, at 95% probability accuracy, dropping to 60% at roughly 3 minutes, essentially random beyond 12 minutes, 70 seconds. The number was at once smaller and larger than she'd imagined. Smaller because it seemed almost modest. 70 seconds was barely more than a minute, and she'd been thinking of the Veth as having something like prophetic vision. Larger because 70 seconds, in a tactical engagement, was an enormous window. 70 seconds was enough time to know a grenade was coming before it was thrown, to know a flanking element was moving before they crossed the line of departure, to know a sniper had acquired your position before the round arrived. 70 seconds was the entire span of a firefight. She made notes in the field notebook. Then she put the notebook down and looked at the viewport and thought about what it would mean to exist inside 70 seconds of continuous foreknowledge, to always know what was about to happen, to never be surprised, to never experience that particular quality of human consciousness that her mother had called, once, the most honest thing about us, the genuine ignorance of the next moment. It would be extraordinary, she thought. It would be a kind of power that was almost godlike, and it would be, she thought in the next breath, a kind of imprisonment. To know what was coming was to be unable to be surprised by it. To be unable to be surprised was to be unable to discover. To be unable to discover was, well, she thought about the children on the Meridian, running to the viewport when the navigation system announced a course correction, crowding against the small circle of real glass to look at the stars and wonder what they'd find. Knowing that the stars existed, not knowing what the stars held. That not knowing had been the engine of everything. She thought about the Veth soldiers looking up as they withdrew from Briar. She thought maybe she understood, now, what they'd been looking for. Not just the future they'd lost, the feeling of the future being there. Available, knowable, the constant hum of the chronoville feeding them information, the security of never being caught unaware, the profound comfort of a universe that spoke to you in its own language and told you what was coming. Losing that, she suspected, was not just a tactical vulnerability. It was a kind of grief. She wrote that down too. Not in the report to Central, which required a different register of language, but in the notebook, in the small handwriting she used for things she wasn't ready to explain. They weren't just fighting for territory. They were fighting for the future. Their ability to read it, to live inside it, was the most precious thing they had. When we took it away, even temporarily, even tactically, we were reaching into their experience of reality and pulling something out. I don't regret it. You do what you have to do, but I want to understand it. Understanding things that cost other people something seems like the least we owe them. 2 years after Korvath Afi, in a briefing room on a station above a planet that had once been a Veth staging ground and was now, after a campaign that Mara had helped plan from the Strategic Development Command, a joint administration zone, she met She Who Reads the River. The name the xeno-linguistic software produced was still imperfect, still only an approximation of something that existed in a language structured around temporal perception rather than linear narrative. But the Veth officer across the table from her was real and present, and was looking at her with the particular quality of attention that Mara had learned, over 2 years, to interpret as Veth curiosity, a stillness more complete than normal, a slight tilt of the elongated head, the chronoville vibrating at a frequency that the monitoring equipment nearby registered as heightened activity. She Who Reads the River was the Veth's equivalent of a peace negotiator, which, in their culture, meant something slightly different than it meant in humanity's. Not someone seeking resolution, but someone assigned to read the probable futures of multiple resolution paths and recommend the one that led to the most stable outcome. Their culture's version of a strategic planner, the most future-sighted person they could assign to a negotiation. There was, Mara thought, a kind of poetry in that. She Who Reads the River looked at her for a long time without speaking, which in Veth social protocol meant something like, I am reading your immediate future and finding it consistent with productive exchange. Mara looked back and said nothing, because looking back was the human equivalent, the human who unmade the pass. The translator rendered the Veth's first words, a second after the sounds reached her. Yes, Mara said, we have thought about you. A pause while the translator caught up, its algorithm struggling with the tense structure, because Veth language had a tense for events that have always been true in the record of space-time, that human languages didn't have a word for. We understood afterward what you did, the mechanism. We had not thought a species could operate that way, without the river, Without the future? Without the translator produced a word that was the literal rendering as the sense of what comes, and then a note saying, idiomatic translation uncertain, the knowledge of what is next. We did not think a consciousness could function in that state. Without knowing, Mara thought about how to answer this. She thought about her mother at the viewport of the meridian, looking at the stars and explaining space-time. She thought about the children running to the glass. She thought about the dice in her pocket that she still carried, the worn six-sided dice with the chipped corner, because some habits were philosophical positions expressed in the shape of the body. We don't function despite not knowing, she said finally. We function because of it. The not knowing is the engine. It's what makes the next moment matter. If we knew what was coming, we'd have nothing to discover. The Veth officer was still for a long moment. We have discussed this, the translation rendered. Among those who study you, what you describe as the engine, we experience as another translator's note. Idiomatic translation uncertain. The space where the river cannot be read. We call it the dark, not threatening dark, just the part of the future that cannot be seen. We call it the present, Mara said. Another long stillness. Perhaps the translation said slowly, we have been afraid of your present. The words landed quietly in the room. Outside, through the viewport, the Joint Administration Zone's new infrastructure was visible, human and Veth prefab structures in their distinct architectural languages, sitting side by side with the careful distance of neighbors still learning each other's habits. Perhaps, Mara said, we have been afraid of your future. She who raids. The river made a gesture that the cultural briefing notes said was a Veth expression of something between acknowledgement and agreement. A slight rotation of one of the triple-jointed limbs that mimicked the direction of temporal flow. Then we have something, the translation said, to teach each other. Mara took the dice out of her pocket and set them on the table between them. Where do you want to start, she said. The dice sat there, worn at the edges, patient, unrolled. Between a human who lived without a river and a Veth who could read one. Between two species who had fought each other to an exhausted draw and were now sitting in a room, trying to figure out what came next. In the four-dimensional structure of space-time, the block universe that Brian Greene had described, and her mother had loved, and the Veth had lived. Inside, since before humanity had discovered fire, this moment existed. Fixed, real, permanent. It would always have happened. This moment in this room, these two beings across a table with a pair of dice between them. Ahead of her, the future was unwritten. She picked up the dice, let them rest in her palm, their familiar weight neither heavy nor light, exactly right, the weight of genuine possibility, and she let them go.